Faces of Alaska. Mr. Whitekeys.
Alaskans know Mr. Whitekeys as a comedian, a musician, and a spam-loving nightclub impresario. Whether you know him from his days behind the piano at the Fly-By nightclub, his popular stage shows like The Whale-Fat Follies, or his regular commentary on local television, chances are you've never had the chance to get to know the man behind the loud Hawaiian shirt. I recently sat down with Keys, as he likes to be called, at his studio in Anchorage to get a better sense of how he came to Alaska and why he's chosen to make this place his home and his muse for over 40 years. Hey, thanks for being with us today. I really appreciate you being here.
It is totally my pleasure to be on a station that shows the Lawrence Welk Show every week.
Okay.
You know, I'm feeling right at home already.
All right. Everyone knows he was Keys, or Mr. Whitekeys, or Keys. But what is the real you really like? I mean, what are you, a regular guy when you're not, performing?
What you see here is what you get. I'm a shallow guy. There's nothing underneath anything. I'm just a sleazy guy looking for a good time, and that's what I do.
Well, how did you get to be that sleazy guy looking for a good time? Can you tell me, what was your life like as a kid? I understand you are Arizona, born and raised, or am I wrong there?
Well, I lived in Arizona for a long time, and yeah, I mean, I was just a regular guy racing cars and and having a good time and trying to play some rock and roll.
Did you have a keyboard training? Were you a trained musician? Did you take piano lessons as a child, or did you play by ear?
For a couple of years in Phoenix, I took organ lessons. Okay, and I had this organ teacher that came over to the house once a week. And she had been a former organist in some bars on the Las Vegas Strip, and it was and she had been through all that whole scene. But she had moved to Phoenix when she married a guy who owned a funeral home. And so every day, she played the organ for 4 or 5 funerals. So then she would show up on Wednesday afternoons at our house, and she'd walk in the door sobbing. She'd just walk in there, oh my God, I just played the most beautiful funeral, and he wanted to hear Don't Fence Me In because that was his favorite song. And she would sit there in the house and cry for a half an hour because of all these funerals. And my mother would feed her coffee and cookies, and finally she'd calm down enough to give me a half-hour organ lesson, and then she'd leave and play the evening funerals. And that's my musical training.
So you sort of served as a therapist as a kid. Well, that's pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you take lessons from a teacher who's just sobbing all the way through your lesson. It leaves a mark.
I know you went to Duke University, so you must be smart, because no dummies go to Duke.
If you got the money, anybody can go to Duke.
You think so? Well, we did a little research on your Duke years.
Oh.
It says in your book, Alaska Bazaar, you say in your book, Alaska Bazaar, that you learned to play Bach by ear on the Duke pipe organ. True?
Well, no, it wasn't by ear.
Oh.
No, you don't play Bach by ear. But I'd always loved the Bach organ music, because basically that was what was always being played by the Phantom of the Opera. And this is not that Broadway crap Phantom of the Opera. This is the real Phantom of the Opera, from the movies. And he's always at the organ, and he's playing Bach on the organ, and so I had made up my mind at some point that I was going to learn how to do that, and so I just went down and got a book of Bach sheet music and did that. And then when I got to college, they had this magnificent pipe organ in this old hall that was there, but you couldn't play it if you weren't a music major, and so I wasn't a music major. I wasn't allowed to play this organ, but I didn't want to be sitting around my room on a little portable combo organ, trying to play Bach. So that was when I taught myself to pick locks, because they had this pipe organ. There was a lock on the keyboard cover, the wooden cover. And so I learned to pick locks so I could go in there anytime I wanted, and I could pick the lock and just open up the organ and play the organ and play Bach.
The young Whitekeys soon proved his musical ambitions were not limited to the pipe organ. And you were in a grunge band at Duke.
Some guy found. I mean, we made a record that we made 10 copies. I mean, they weren't even really records in those. They were what's called acetate. They were demo things that they'd press in the studio. Some guy got a hold of one and sold it for $1,400 on eBay. I mean, this was just totally amazing. I mean, it's like Elvis, you know? I mean, he makes more money dead than he did when he was alive. So here we had one of these, you know, just garage band horrible albums, and it sold for $1,400. Then the guy somehow had come across another one of the only 10 that were made, and he sold that for $900 because it was in sort of crappy condition with a lot of scratches and stuff. And this guy, Wolfgang, in Germany, then decided he wanted to re-release this. And, you know, and he says in the liner notes, you know, that this is the greatest undiscovered band of the 60s in the entire South. Every other band had already been discovered. Of course, we're the greatest undiscovered one. We're the only band left that hasn't been discovered.
Can I ask you, why did you come to Alaska in the first place? What drove you, or what prompted you, or did you have a real desire to come to Alaska, or did you just get a free ticket or something in a raffle and use it?
Well, I was sitting in Phoenix, and you know, I got out of college. I wasn't doing anything in particular, and I had all these odd jobs, and I kept running into guys who'd been to Alaska, and every one of them was telling a story that was more outrageous than the one before. I mean, this was stuff like, you know, one guy that been up here and, you know, ran into a guy who made $10,000 in a week on a crab boat and just signing on as a deckhand. There were all these stories about guys catching fish. I ran into this guy who was an Italian plumber. And he had come up here to go fishing and with a couple of guys he used to know in Chicago who were members of the mob, you know, and so every story you heard about Alaska was just more outrageous than the one before. And I just decided, you know, look, if this place is anything like what I'm hearing about, I got to see this place because this just sounds like totally cool. So I sold this car that I had, and I bought this old Ford van on a used car lot. And this Ford van had belonged to a dog groomer. It was a poodle groomer. And there was this painting on the side of this van that said, you know, Arcadia Board and Groom Room. And then there's this painting of a poodle sitting under one of those old bell-shaped hair dryers reading a copy of Pooch Gossip. And this is what was on the side of the van. So me and this friend of mine, we just pile in this van. We drive to Alaska. And the thing also, because it was in Phoenix and it was, you know, an uninsulated van, it was one of those just metal wall vans, but it had an air conditioner on top of it that was, you know, just immense. And this thing in Phoenix would take the temperature from 110 down to 40 in like 30 seconds. So we're coming to Alaska in this uninsulated van with this giant air conditioner on it and all this paintings of poodles under hair dryers and curlers on the side. And we get to Anchorage, and the great thing was that there weren't any dog groomers in Anchorage in those days. And this truck, Arcadia Board and Groom, had a phone number that was a 279 exchange, and it had an address on 7th Street. So you couldn't tell what city it was from. And we'd go downtown and go into a bar and drink a beer and come back, and there'd be like 8 notes under the windshield saying, "Call me, I need to have my dog done." You know? And, you know, we got here, and the place was just weird. This place, you know, this was the early 70s, and it was totally a weird place. The thing about Alaska was you didn't need any training, any education, any aptitude, any intelligence at all to get paid more money than you could anywhere else in the country. I mean, it just, you know, it's still that way. It's not as much as it was. But the only reason anybody was here was because they were running from the law or something else. They were running away from something. They were going to the ends of the earth. They didn't need, you know, any training, any talent at all to get hired. And this place was just so weird that I never left. I mean, I said, this is the greatest place in the world.
Whatever he may have been running from, Keyes could not escape his taste for adventure or his love of music. Did you go straight into music, or I want to get back to the getting out of Duke? You had a degree. I'm assuming you graduated. You had a degree from Duke in psychology. What did Mom and Dad say when you said, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to drive the dog grooming truck to Alaska and seek my fortune"? Were they supportive, or were they going, "Get a job. We just spent, a cajillion dollars on your education"? Did you have that conflict?
Well, no. I mean, look at look at everybody you know today. I mean, you got a 21, 22-year-old kid that's still living in the house. You want him the hell out of there as fast as they can go. You don't care whether they're going to Alaska or not. It was no, it was fine to come up here. And again, I mean, I was here. I walked into a temp agency the first day that I hit Anchorage. And the guy says, "Can you run a jackhammer?" I said, "Well, I suppose." And he said, "Okay, here," and gives me this address. And I went down to this building, this warehouse down on Ship Creek, and they had it was a big concrete warehouse, and they wanted a big garage door there. So they put up a scaffold, and they gave me a jackhammer and said, "Knock a hole in this wall." I never held a jackhammer before, but that was my first job in Alaska. And every once in a while, I go down and visit that door. It's still there. And I drive by, I put that door in there.
Well, you did fit right in because it was a town that needed everything. There was a period in Anchorage where everything was needed. It didn't matter what skill you had, somebody needed you. And whether you knew how to do it or not, they still needed you.
So I get here, and I'm reading the newspaper one day, and there's an ad in the want ads, piano player wanted, and it was at this place, Chilkoot Charlie's, which had just opened. It had been open 3-4 months when I got there. And I walked in, and I never played piano in a bar. I mean, we had some grunge band and played some college frat parties and stuff, but never had a real job playing in a real bar. And walked into Chilkoot's and got the job, and started playing piano there. And those days it was just brutal, because the bars in Anchorage were open until 5 o'clock. So a gig for the night was 9 o'clock until 4:30. It was 7.5 hours. And you're playing rock and roll, and you're screaming, and you'd lose your voice by 2 o'clock in the morning, but you still had 2.5 hours to go. And you'd finish, and your knuckles are just, you've got, arthritis when you're 21, because you're pounding on this piano for 7.5 hours. And I did that for 5 years. And like every night for 5 years, or 6 nights a week, something like that. And, at the end of 5 years, I woke up one morning and I said, "I've been playing piano in Chilkoot Charlie's for 5 years. Who would do that?" And I walked in and said, "I'm giving you 2 weeks notice. I'm leaving." I had no talent for that at all. I'd never done that before, but you didn't have to in those days. Everybody was drunk. It was the 70s. There was nothing else to do here.
Luck turned out to be on the young musician's side, having arrived during what he calls a legendary time in Alaska history. You made it playing music at an era when it was very difficult to make it playing music.
Oh, it wasn't that difficult. It wasn't that difficult, because if you think back to those days, I mean, it was it was a boom town. Anchorage has always been a boom town, and we were getting ready for the pipeline, and there was just huge amounts of money. It was a legendary time in this country. I mean, there are these legendary times like the Roaring '20s in New York City, or the Prohibition era with Al Capone in Chicago, in the '30s, and Kansas City was another one with a corrupt mayor, even in the middle of the Depression. The town was just happening. And Haight-Ashbury in the '60s. There's these legendary periods in America. They were all accompanied by music. There was this, you think about the Roaring '20s and the music that went along with it. Kansas City jazz came out of Kansas City during the Depression. And Haight-Ashbury, of course, was the whole hippie and psychedelic rock scene, and all that was happening. Anchorage in the '70s was a legendary time. There was money flowing everywhere with the pipeline. It was just incredible. And if you look at that, you said there was no place to play music. There were over 30 bars in Anchorage that had a band, not just a guy with a guitar, but a band, 3 people or more, at least 5 nights a week, there were like 30 bars in this town. And if you think, I mean, how many people have a full band in a bar in Anchorage today? And it's like 4, maybe 5. The scene today is nothing like it was then. There were incredible musicians that were just passing through town that would come up here and, making a lot of money and taking off and going somewhere else. And there were these amazing musicians that were here.
Well, did that keep you in Alaska? Obviously, it shaped you. It shaped what you're doing these days. Did you stay in Alaska specifically because the musical gigs were here?
No, not at all. I stayed here, and I still stay here, because this is the weirdest place on the face of the earth. I mean, you remember, a few years ago, it was when Jack Coghill was a lieutenant governor, okay? In his resume, it said, there was a line in there that said he was an amateur undertaker. We had a lieutenant governor who was an amateur undertaker. Now, what is an amateur undertaker, first of all? But we had a guy who not only was one, and he was proud to put it on his resume, and we elected him lieutenant governor. I mean, the place is just weird, it doesn't make any sense. There's no rhyme or reason to it. We've got all these guys, whether they're politicians or just, piano players in sleazy bars, that have no idea what they're doing, but they still get hired for the job. And it's still that way today. And you can't leave a place like this.
Well, fertile ground then for the fly-by nightclub.
Absolutely.
With an independent spirit and a driving curiosity, it wasn't long before White Keys decided to set out on his own in business. You eventually decided to open your own business. Was that difficult? Did you need loans?
There'd always been a club out there where the Millennium Hotel is, out on the lake. It was Joe Spenard's original wagon trail that went from downtown along the route of Spenard Road, and there was a little pavilion out there, and people went out there for picnics. And then they opened like the Lakeshore Club and the Idle Hour and places like that out on the lake, way out of town. And some guys had bought that property late in the 70s, and with the idea of building a hotel. But there were these mammoth restrictions. I mean, they had to get financing for it. They had to get the zoning for it. They had to clear it with the FAA and the airport because they wanted to build more than a one-story structure on the shores of a lake where there was a float plane path. So they eventually got the place open. And they had a top 40 disco called the Flying Machine in one half of the building. And the other half, they'd hired a manager. And his dream in life, the thing that he thought that would be the ultimately successful venture, was to open a Wendy's without a franchise. He'd worked at a Wendy's one time. So he basically copied everything he remembered from a Wendy's and opened this hamburger restaurant next door to the disco. And it failed within, 6 months. I mean, it was out of business. So these guys tried to open a Mexican restaurant, and they tried to, a couple of different private clubs and a couple of different bars. And so they had this property they're just trying to hold on to until the financing and everything was in place to build a hotel, but they didn't want to lose their shirts, and they've got this one half with the disco that's going great guns, the other half is just failing miserably. And I ran into the guy, one of the guys that owned it, and basically he was totally desperate, and he said, "Hey kid, you want the keys to a bar?" All they wanted was enough rent that, it wasn't driving him down the drain. So I just became partners with these guys and, started a bar. And I didn't have anything to lose. Why not? I mean, if it lasted 6 months, it'd be better than anything else that happened there. And so that's how the Fly-By nightclub started.
So timing was actually everything, even though you didn't know it was timing, because those were the days when people were looking for entertainment. They had tremendous amounts of money in their pocket.
So here's a guy that comes and gives me the keys to a bar and says, you want to run a bar and you want to be partners in this thing. And I had never run a bar. I had no idea how to do it. But all the years that I had played in bars, I'm just a curious guy. So I want to know everything there is to know about everything, And it's like Thomas Jefferson, those guys in that era. I mean, they could be a doctor, they could be a lawyer and an architect and a farmer all at the same time. I mean, it was possible to know everything on earth at that time. It's not anymore, but I still want to. So I'd be in a bar and, some guy'd be taking inventory and, oh, what are you doing? I'm taking inventory. Well, how do you do that? And I'd always just, ask these questions. So when all of a sudden, I get the keys to a bar, I've got, some idea of what these guys have been doing. I mean, most musicians walk in, play the songs, walk out to the end of the night. But, I'd hang around there and ask guys what they were doing and sort of see what was happening. And that was all it took to run the Fly-By-Night Club.
And it caught on. It caught on amazingly fast. It was like a grass fire. All of a sudden, people were going there. And then by the time you moved up the street to Spenard proper, you had a clientele that followed.
Well, again, there was, we were just sleazy guys out for a good time. That's all we were trying to do. I was running this place basically to provide a place for me to play music and other people that were really good to play music. And everybody else in the state up until that time and still up until now is running a bar to make money on alcohol. And they hire musicians just to increase their alcohol sales. And that's true with every bar in this state. We had the opposite approach. We were there in the music business, and we were selling alcohol in order to support the musicians and the music scene that we wanted to present in there.
So I think very, very typical of many people who came to Alaska in those days, sort of a go for broke attitude. Damn the torpedoes, I'm going to do this, and not even think about failure.
It was more like, I haven't got anything to lose. I mean, and it was not a, wild financial success. If you look at it, nobody did that before we did. And nobody's really done that after we did it, because running an operation like that is not the best financial model in the world. I mean, we did okay. We did fine. But, every other bar that was popular in town made way more money than we did, because they were serving the bare minimum of stuff. They didn't have a big staff. If they had a hot dog, I mean, that would be in a bar, that would be the extent of what they had other than pickled hard-boiled eggs. And they weren't going to any effort to sort of up the ante of what the industry did. And we were just doing it because I wanted to, because it was fun, and I wanted to do it, and we were in it for the fun of it. I mean, it just, as a financial model, it's not something you're going to take to your business class and have everybody say, that's what you ought to be doing. Because it's really not. I mean, you can do way better doing stuff that's a lot easier.
Known for describing it as Alaska bizarre, White Keys certainly has his own take on what it means to be an Alaskan. So many of our notable Alaskans now did come up in those days with a college degree hot in their pocket and went straight into either politics or administration, city government, or social work. But so you never even considered that.
Have you ever been to a municipal assembly meeting? Have you ever been to a legislative committee meeting? I mean, holy moly, what idiot. And there I consider the fact that anybody even wants to be in office to be a character flaw. I mean, this is just, who would want to do that?
Well, I have to say, you certainly have an eye for the ironic. And in Alaska Bizarre, you mentioned that you really wanted to open the Fly-By-Night Club to give overeducated people who hated to get up in the morning something to do. And I'm like, are you describing yourself?
Well, exactly. That was totally it. And we had this whole crew, for years that were exactly that. I mean, we had these, brilliant people that were tending bar and waiting tables and cooking, and I mean, it was just it was just very cool, because we had this great crew of people in there.
Well, there's no course of study for exactly what you do, and it's very difficult to pinpoint it. Could you be doing what you're doing? Like, if you were not in Alaska, could you be Mr. White Keys, say in California or Kansas? Do you think that would ever work?
Probably not, because the one key thing about Alaskans is that they do laugh at themselves. They realize we're all losers. We know we're all losers. We know everybody else around us is losers. We know we can't make it anywhere else. And we're fine with that. I mean, we're able to laugh at the situation that we're in. And there's not a lot of other states that I've run into, and cities and places where people do that. People have that attitude. They're very serious about what they're doing. But Alaskans, the real dangerous part about living in Alaska, which still is today, is that the longer you've lived here, the more you start to think that this place is normal. And it's not normal. It's totally not normal. It's not as weird as it was, 40 years ago, but it's still totally off the grid and totally strange. And people still don't, when you start accepting this as normal, then you've lost it completely. I mean, you've got to realize what is happening here.